Welcome to Banyan Books, Branches of Wisdom, celebrating the joy of bright ideas and heartful lifelong learning. Branches of Wisdom is a series of intimate conversations with the world's most influential authors and visionaries. We explore spirituality and the human mind, ecology and culture. Most episodes are recorded with a live audience. You can join our live events and submit questions to your favorite guests. Check out our upcoming schedule at banyan.com. Since 1970, Banyan Books has been a rich oasis at the crossroads of wisdom and philosophy, offering resources for humanity's evolving paths. We're a locally owned, independent bookstore in the heart of Vancouver's Kitsilano neighborhood. Visit us in person or shop online at banyan.com. Please subscribe, follow, like, and leave your reviews for the podcast. And now, enjoy. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Banyan Books podcast. My name is Ross Makichi, and today our honored guest is Sumbul Ali-Karamali. Sumbul Ali-Karamali is an award-winning author and speaker whose books, articles, blogs, and speaking events are her way of promoting intercultural understanding in the world. Sumbul grew up in Southern California, answering questions about Islam and Muslims. With her degree in English from Stanford University, her law degree from the University of California at Davis, and a law degree in Islamic law from the University of London's School of Oriental and African Studies, she left the world of corporate law to start writing books to answer those very questions. When not writing, Sumbul is a fiction and nonfiction judge, a board member of nonprofits dedicated to multicultural education, and a member of the steering committee of Women in Islamic Spirituality and Equality, or WISE, as well as the Muslim Women's Global Shura Council, both of which aim to promote women's rights and human rights from an Islamic perspective. Our guest's first book, The Muslim Next Door, The Quran, the Media, and That Veil Thing, was published in 2008. In it, she addressed the kinds of questions she'd always been asked, but which were never answered in the media or even in classrooms. While on her book tour, several teachers complained to her of the absence of age-appropriate books on Islam for high school students. As a result, in 2012, she wrote her second book, Growing Up Muslim: Understanding the Beliefs and Practices of Islam, a nonfiction chapter book. The book was written for ages 10 and up, but is appropriate for adults as well. Today, Sumbul is here with us in conversation about her newest book, which was released in August 2020. It's titled Demystifying Sharia: What It Is, How It Works, and Why It's Not Taking Over Our Country. For me, I've got to say this book was very inspiring. I'm someone who knew almost nothing about Islam or Sharia or what it means to be a practicing Muslim in the world today. I had a very vague, kind of unexamined idea that Islam might be sexist or violent and outdated in today's world. This, it seems, is a common sentiment, and one that our honored guest very skillfully dismantles and clarifies the origins of, helping us to see the difference between the actual essence of Sharia and the way it may be misinterpreted or misused. To learn more about her work, you can visit her website, which is sumbulali.com. Banyan community, please join me in a warm welcome for Sumbul Ali-Karamali. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much. And for all of you who can't spell my name, which I totally sympathize with, you can also go to muslimnextdoor.com, and that will also get you to my website. So thank you, Ross, for your introduction. And thank you for having me here. It's really an honor to be at this bookstore. And since I've been writing books, I have a new and deep appreciation for independent booksellers. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. And please, throughout this discussion, excuse any of my mispronunciations. I'm doing my best.
Oh, it's fine. I will answer to just about anything, but you did a great job with my name.
Okay, thank you. So you made this jump from corporate law into writing. Can you tell us a bit about the background of how that occurred?
Yeah, well, I really feel like it started when I was a kid because, I grew up in just really in LA County in Los Angeles. And when I grew up, there were hardly any Muslims around me. I grew up in a white middle class neighborhood, and um, I got all kinds of questions, like including, are you white or black? Or, you're Indian, do you wear feathers in your hair and paint your face? So I got all kinds of questions, and certainly religion doesn't come up a lot when you're an elementary school kid playing on the playground, but every so often I went to a birthday party and I couldn't eat the pepperoni pizza. And so I had to explain that it was pork and I couldn't eat pork because I was Muslim. And as I got older, sometimes, I started praying regularly 5 times a day. And sometimes I'd have to leave my friends to go pray. And sort of late middle school, early high school, I started fasting more regularly too. Some of your listeners might know that that means no food or water until sunset for 30 days. And that happens every year. And I'll tell you, like sometimes I just got myself into these fixes. So I went to school one day in high school and I was fasting, no food or water till sunset. And it was hot. It was like May or June. And I realized when I got to school that day was the day we were supposed to run the mile for the physical fitness, like for the presidential physical fitness test, which we did every year. And at the time there weren't any Muslims around me. My friends didn't know any other Muslims. My teachers didn't know any Muslims. And so the thought of actually going to my PE coach and saying, well, I can't run the mile because, I'm fasting was just mind-bogglingly incomprehensible to me. So of course I just sucked it up and ran without any food or water. I was telling, by the way, a 6th grade class this story, and one boy raised his hand and he said, what was your time? So I said, I don't remember. But anyway, so I answered a lot of questions, and then when I went to college, I lived in the dorm, and everybody knows what everybody else is doing. And suddenly I was thinking, how am I going to pray 5 times a day without my roommate noticing when she lives a foot away from me? And how am I going to figure out if there's pork in the dorm food when nobody knows what's in the dorm food? And such questions, and as I got older, I went to law school, started working. Islam was increasingly in the news, and I still got all these questions that people wanted me to answer, and some of them were hostile, and some of them were just curious. And so I thought, and then when I started working, people started asking me for book recommendations, and there was nothing on Islam. There was nothing interesting to read. There were academic books, or there were Sufi poetry volumes, but there weren't any books that just answered the kinds of questions I've been answering my whole life. And so when my husband's job took us to London, I decided to do an additional degree in Islamic law from the University of London. And actually, I sort of did this degree so that I could write a book. So I came back and I started writing books. So that's what happened. I was just on an interview and the interviewer said, that's the nerdiest thing I've ever heard of. You actually got a degree so that you could write a book. So what can I say?
Sounds very focused and goal oriented.
So that's how it all started. So it's kind of, my writing books, I try to write them. They're all in first person and they're all introductions to Islam and Muslims. And I try to write them as if I were, say, sitting across the table from you having tea, and in a conversational, personal way, because that's how I've been answering questions.
Yeah, and that's definitely the feeling right from the start. And I found it really fascinating because I don't know if I even had heard the term Sharia much before this, and maybe you can just start by, for those who don't know, what Sharia is actually, and then after that we can get into some of the ways that it's been misused or misinterpreted.
Mm-hmm. Well, so when I wrote my first book, which came out in 2008, nobody was talking about this word. Nobody, in fact, even Muslims, when I was growing up, nobody knew this word Sharia. I don't think I learned it until I did my degree in Islamic law. So it's an academic term of art. It's not something that is in general usage. And when I wrote my first book, it just wasn't out there, and so I didn't cover it. And yet 2 years later, there are suddenly anti-Sharia protests, and you know, people are saying that Sharia is going to take over the United States, and it's amazing to me. And we can get to why that happened later. But essentially, I mean, even Muslims can't really define Sharia, so it's gotten very out of hand. But it's hard to define because it doesn't have one fixed meaning. So Sharia literally in Arabic means the road to water, or the road to the watering place. And that's the road you want to be on if you're in the desert, right? And in religious terms, it means the righteous path, the path you want to be on to quench your spiritual thirst. So the righteous path, or the path of God, the path that you want to be on. So that's what it means in sort of abstract terms. For early Muslims in the 7th century, Islam was formed in the 7th century. Early Muslims were asking themselves the question, well, what do I do to be on the path of God? How do I act? What do I eat? How do I behave? And for them, they had 2 clues. They had the Quran, which is the Muslim holy book, and they had the Sunnah, which is the words and deeds of the Prophet Muhammad. And so they looked to these for answers, to answer the question, what do I do to be on the path of God? And sometimes they found the answers, but sometimes they didn't. And so they started interpreting those religious texts, and they filled thousands and thousands of books of interpretation on the religious text, trying to answer this question, what do I do to be on the way of God? So this whole mass of interpretive literature is called fiqh, which means understanding. And the fiqh is not laws, it's not rules, it's a mass of opinions and debates and arguments and, you know, sort of just sometimes consensus, sometimes minority arguments, sometimes, you know, it's all kinds of different debates. There's, in fact, on all the issues of Islamic law in the centuries, only about 1% achieved a consensus of the scholars on what the answer was. Right. So that means 99% of all the interpretations and the answers that they tried to come up with, 99% of them are subject to disagreement, which means that, and so sometimes Sharia, in addition to the path of God, is also, it also refers to the Quran and the Sunnah, because those are the divine texts in Islam, but sometimes it refers to the Quran and the Sunnah and the fiqh, this whole massive interpretive literature. And by extension, to the whole sort of legal tradition in Islam. And by legal tradition, I don't mean law the way we think of law, which is rigid and enforceable. I mean law as in religious guidelines, mostly having to do with personal conduct, that tell us as Muslims what we should do to be on the path of God. So does that make sense?
It does. And one of the things that I was struck by is that it's almost inherently plural and flexible in its appropriate application.
Mm-hmm. That's right, because and there's a reason for this, and the reason is that when the Islamic scholars were applying methodologies to the religious text and interpreting them and coming up with answers, as long as they were learned scholars who applied the accepted methodology, their answer was valid. So if I were a mufti or a mullah or a sheikh, or lots of different words for an Islamic scholar, and there were some women, even in early Islam, if I were an Islamic scholar and someone asked me a question, and I looked to the religious text and then looked to other interpretations and then applied the methodology and came up with my own interpretation and came up with an answer, like, yes, you can do whatever it is, or no, you can't do whatever it is, I would always say, I would give my opinion, which was called a fatwa, and I would say at the end of it, but God knows best. And what that meant is that I think I'm right because I've done everything I should do, but maybe that guy over there who has a different answer, maybe he's right. And only God knows best. Only God knows which one of us is right, right? Because we're both recognized Islamic scholars applying the accepted methodology. So I think that's what's, so inherently you have this variation and disagreement. So if you say, what does the Sharia say on any one thing, chances are it'll say more than one thing, because you had these Islamic scholars and they often disagreed, more often than not, and yet each of their opinions were valid interpretations of Islam.
Right. Okay. I think what I'm about to send your way is a two-part question, but first off, it's how do we identify the proper use of Sharia versus people claiming legitimate Sharia? And I think this ties in with what is called maqasid al-Sharia, the goals of Sharia.
So the maqasid al-Sharia, so as I said, there wasn't a whole lot of agreement in the fiqh, in the opinions, but the scholars did all agree that all Islamic law had to comply with the goals of the Sharia. And the goals were articulated as 5 or 6 goals. And these were the protection of life, the protection of religion, the protection of access to resources, the protection of family, and the protection of intellect, including education. So
protection of religion includes all religion. Is that true?
So the protection of being able to practice religion, yes.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And of course, since they were Islamic scholars, they would have been focused on their own religion, because everyone's focused on their own situation. But Islamic history, all Islamic civilizations in history were multi-religious civilizations, and Sharia only applied to the Muslims. So even historically, Jews and Christians and Zoroastrians were ruled by their own religion and culture and not by Sharia. So I'll just give you an example. So Muslims, as a lot of people know, are not allowed to eat pork or drink alcohol. And yet, even in medieval Islamic lands, Jews were allowed to cultivate wine and Christians were allowed to cultivate pigs because they were not subject to the same restraints.
Uh-huh. Now, you make it clear in the book that Sharia is not the law of the land in any place in the world right now, which seems contrary to many people's belief, especially if we look at countries like Iran or Saudi Arabia. Can you clarify that for us?
Yeah, and that's a complicated question.
Right. These are all complex issues, people.
Yes,
so.
Very complicated.
Yeah.
So, and the reason it's complicated is because you have to know a little bit about how Sharia works in order to see that why it's not Sharia anywhere in the world. So first, how it worked. The Sharia-based legal system was in effect in Islamic lands for over 1,000 years. You could say about 1,300 years, in fact. That's the longest continually running legal tradition in the world. And so it's unique in human history. Now, the way it worked is that those that governed in Islamic civilization were separate from those who developed the religious law. And early on in Islamic history, there was a big fight over this. The rulers also wanted to be able to develop the religious law. They wanted to get to impose the version they wanted. They wanted to have control over the religious law. And there was a big argument, and the scholars said, nope, you can't have it. We have authority, you don't have authority. and the scholars were tortured and punished, but they emerged victorious. And so for the rest of Islamic history, the ruler governed and made rules about like taxation and speed limits and market regulation. But the religious scholars are the ones who developed the religious law. And so even though there was some overlap in old times, generally speaking, there was a separation of governance and religion in Islamic culture. The religious scholars were on the ground. So if I were someone who wanted to divorce, for example, but I didn't know what situations I could get a divorce under, and Muslim women, by the way, did have the right to divorce from the very beginning, from the 7th century. If I wanted a divorce, I could go to one Islamic scholar and he could give me an answer. And if I didn't like that answer, I could go to another Islamic scholar and he might give me another answer. If I didn't like that either, I could go to a third one. And I could do this until I found the answer that I liked. And now, if it came to some sort of a dispute, if my husband, I said, look, I can get a divorce. My husband said, no, you can't. Then we might go to court. The judge would look at all the fatwas, which is what I had, right? I had lots of different fatwas. He would look at all the fatwas, other situations, other circumstances, and he would come up with an answer to the dispute. So it sort of worked on the ground. The ruler didn't have a lot to do with it. So Islamic law, or Sharia-based law, was flexible and adaptable because they took into, for one thing, it was varied. It wasn't rigid. You could go to all different kinds of scholars and they might say different things. So it was variable. It also was flexible because all the opinions had to do with factors like need or necessity or time and place or culture. So for example, Muslims are not allowed to eat pork, but if you're starving and there's nothing else to eat, I mean, literally starving, not just really hungry, but if you're starving, you can eat pork. So because of necessity. So there are all kinds of factors that they took into account. So it was a flexible and pluralistic law, meaning that the law came from different sources on the ground. Now, what's happening now is not Sharia. So Iran, for example, well, first of all Muslim majority countries are constitutional states. Most of them have civil codes that are based on the French civil law system. Iran has a civil code and a constitution. And after the 1979 revolution, what the leaders there started to do was take Islamic sounding provisions and tack them on to the civil code. Now, what happens if you have the government imposing so-called religious law on people? Well, that's a theology. And Iran is the first time that there were, it's not theology, sorry, theocracy. Yeah, theocracy. Iran is the first time in 1400 years of Islamic history that there has been a theocracy. Because before that, you didn't have the ruler imposing religious law. And it's not Sharia, it's a Western style stiff civil code that has, mostly punishments kind of tacked onto it. And that's not how Sharia worked. It's not how the whole system is upended. It's not, anyway. So that's pretty much the case in around the world, even Saudi Arabia. I had my Islamic law professor, I remember he once said that Saudi Arabia would be freer if they actually applied Islamic law, and he was Christian. So what's going on in Saudi Arabia is also a different situation, and it has to do with the Wahhabi extremist sect that partnered with the Al Saud family and sort of founded Saudi Arabia in the early 20th century. Historically, the scholars and the ruler were sort of at odds with one another. In Saudi Arabia, they're partners, and there are other differences too as to why it's really not Sharia the way that Sharia worked for 1,000 years in Islamic lands.
Right. Now, it seems like with anything, the extremists are the ones that get the most press, and the things that are fearful and unappetizing to us are the things that we hear the most about. So we have these groups that, and we hear so much about them, and then that's touted as a reason to fear Islam or Muslim people. And this has come into North America now and Europe, where people are fearing this so-called taking over of society by Sharia. Can you talk about the disinformation? I mean, there's that 2010, you write about the disinformation campaign that was started in the US. Can you speak to that as a start?
Yeah, so in I think it was 2010, I went back for one of my Stanford reunions, and I was at the Stanford bookstore, and it was an alumni authors event, and there I was, hopefully standing beside a pile of my books, hoping that somebody would come and buy one, feeling very awkward. And this older couple who was there for their 50th reunion came up to me and they said, you know, we're really afraid that Sharia law is taking over the United States. And this is kind of the first I had heard of this sentiment. And I said, well, actually it can't, because we have a constitution which prevents that from happening. And they said, well, Rush Limbaugh said it could. And they walked away, didn't buy a book. So, and so I thought, wow, what is going on? So what happened in 2010 is that there was a spike in Islamophobia. And it was very strange because there were no terrorist attacks. There was nothing in particular that happened that was violent that should have given rise to Islamophobia, except that a man named David Yerushalmi, who is an American right-wing lawyer and is part of the well-documented loose Islamophobia network in the United States, what he wanted to do was introduce the idea of a scary Islamic law ready to take over the United States. Now, he's a lawyer. I'm sure he knows that this is not possible because we have a constitution, but he sort of implies this himself, that he didn't really care. What he wanted to do is just introduce the idea and make it part of the public discourse. And so he started to go to state legislatures and tell the legislators that it was their duty to enact anti-Sharia legislation. He said, you have to enact anti-Sharia legislation because otherwise Islamic law is going to take over the United States. This was a colossal waste of time and money. There's no need for such legislation. And yet 14 American states have passed anti-Sharia legislation. The American Bar Association has come out very much against these, and you know, they're unconstitutional in many ways. They actually cause other problems when it comes to evaluating foreign law in American courts, because that happens all the time. You know, we have multinational organizations that have contracts that are governed by a variety of foreign laws, and American courts have to evaluate those. As a matter of course, this has always been the case. So these laws prevent that from happening. One of them has already been struck down as unconstitutional. One of them, which didn't pass in Tennessee, one of them would have made saying my prayers to be a criminal act. So they're really,
Wow, yeah.
Yeah.
How is this kind of law in these 14 states, how is it affecting sort of your average American Muslim citizen?
Well, actually over 200 of these laws have been introduced in 43 states. So even though they've only passed in 14, they've been introduced all over the United States. And what that does in general terms is it otherizes Muslims. It portrays them as being incompatible with the Constitution, as unable to follow American law. You know, the Muslims are portrayed as being required to only follow Sharia law, which is ironic because under Sharia itself, Muslims have to follow the law of the country in which they live. So under Sharia, I have to follow American law. So it's really ironic that they're saying, oh no, you know, Muslims are incompatible with American law and constitution. This is not a new argument, by the way. This argument has been applied to, in America, to the Chinese, to Italians, Jews, to well, now Muslims as incompatible with the Constitution or incompatible with democracy. You know, when I remember, well, I don't remember, but I know that when JFK was running for president, they said he would be more loyal to the Pope than to the United States because he was Catholic. So these arguments are not new arguments, but the way this happened, which is to introduce anti-Sharia legislation, you know, that's kind of a new thing. But what it does is it promotes Islamophobia, it otherizes Muslims, it makes them appear to be incompatible with democracy in the United States.
Right. This concept of fatwa that you mentioned, of course, there's the famous fatwa, the death sentence against Salman Rushdie after he published his book, The Satanic Verses, which created a huge misunderstanding about the actual meaning of fatwa. Can you talk about that?
About Salman Rushdie, and that was
the true meaning of the term.
Yeah. So a fatwa is a reasoned legal opinion by a recognized Islamic scholar. It's not binding. So it's a non-binding legal opinion. Okay, let's try again. A non-binding, well-reasoned legal opinion by a recognized Islamic scholar. It's not law. It's not binding. It's just a legal opinion. It's not unlike if you go to a law firm and say, here's what I want to do, and I want a legal opinion. And then they will do all the research, and then they will give you a letter that is the legal opinion of the law firm. It's not that different. So a fatwa is not something where you go and you know, issue death sentences and tell people that they need to assassinate other people. And sometimes I tell people, look, you know, a quarter of the world's population is Muslim. We're talking about 1.7, 1.8 billion people. If everybody had wanted to assassinate Salman Rushdie, they may very well have, you know, by now we're a quarter of the world's population. But Khomeini's fatwa was a political act. He wanted to burn bridges with the West. He had a personal vendetta against Salman Rushdie because Rushdie had made fun of him. And let's face it, Ayatollah Khomeini it was easy to make fun of him. so he, you know, it was both those things. And so he did this. His fatwa was not agreed with by most Islamic scholars. There were many open letters criticizing the fatwa. And again, you know, fatwa it's not law. It's a legal opinion. I mean, his opinion was flawed because it violated several aspects of Islamic law. But even if it hadn't been flawed, it was just his opinion. And also in Islam, you cannot just assassinate someone without giving them a fair trial. You can't just go assassinate them because they have left Islam, which was I think the basis of the fatwa was sort of apostasy. Even under medieval classical Islamic law, you weren't allowed to just go kill somebody because they left Islam. In fact, there are several examples of the Prophet Muhammad in the 7th century who didn't, you know, punish people who left the Muslim community back then. So it was a political act, and unfortunately, you know, Muslims don't get into the media unless we're doing bad things.
Right.
And there was a Georgetown study that showed that about 90% of news stories that feature Muslims are in the context of violence. So, you know, if I only heard about Buddhism in the context of violence, then I might very well think that Buddhists were violent, more so than other people, right? Oh, by the way, Ross, there's an interesting study. Can I tell you?
Please. Yes.
This is a typical thing, right? I mean, when I was a baby lawyer and I had just started, and there was a partner who sat me down and said, oh, you're Muslim? I have to talk to you. Why are Muslims more violent than other kinds of people? And I was like, here I am looking nonviolent in my new suit and my new pumps and trying to be, you know, a corporate lawyer. And so Stephen Fish, who is a professor at the University of California at Berkeley, decided that he would find out, because this is something that this has been floating around for centuries, right? This idea that Muslims are more violent than other kinds of people. And he thought, well, let's let's just see if they are. If Muslims are more violent than other kinds of people, then homicide rates in Muslim majority countries should be higher, right?
Absolutely.
And so, yeah, so he did this empirical study, this huge empirical study, and he found that actually homicide rates in Muslim majority countries were lower. Not just that, really kind of stunningly, he found that and he controlled for all other factors as well. He also found that the larger the Muslim population, the lower the homicide rate. So that completely defies our normalized cultural understanding of Muslims, right?
Right.
And it's so hard to accept things that are contrary to our worldviews. You know, this, for all of us, I think we've all heard of confirmation bias, right? And it's so hard to hear things that don't confirm our own biases and that are actually contrary to our worldviews. But that's one of them.
It's interesting to me to try and understand the view that we have on women and women's rights in Islam versus the actual reality and the essence of Islam. Can you talk about the teachings in the Quran and the Sunnah about women and women's rights, and then maybe we can get into a little bit about where these perceptions come from about how women are treated in the Muslim world?
Mm-hmm. Well, so first of all, there's no question that some Muslim women are oppressed and in bad situations. There's no question about that. But to attribute that to Islam is a mistake, because one thing to remember is that most Muslim majority countries are developing countries, and they have all the problems of the rest of the developing world. I mean, women are not treated very well in South America either. You know, there are all kinds of problems, right? The throwing acid in women's faces, that's also occurred in Latin America. You know, sexual slavery, honor killings, those kinds of things are prevalent in developing countries. So to say that, well, if it's Muslim women, then it's because of Islam that they're in a bad situation. Whereas if it's Christian women, it's because they're in a developing country. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So, so I never knew Islam was sexist until someone at my law firm told me. You know, because you know, my parents, the most important thing to them was that I be financially independent and that I not have to rely on anyone. They were so strict when it came to schoolwork and doing well in school, and they were very rigid about how I had to be a doctor, because in their mind, they were Indian immigrants, and in their mind, a doctor was the only way that you could be financially independent. And so I was, of course, a grave disappointment when I went to law school. So, but you know, I never felt any sexism until, you know, until people around me started talking about Islam as sexist. And I thought, wow, I didn't know that. I'm Muslim. So, so even now, so I always thought of Islam as feminist because that's what my parents taught me. They said, you know, the Prophet said, pursue knowledge, even if you have to go all the way to China, which was a long way by camel in those days, right? And this applies even more in Islam to women, at least according to some scholars. It applies even more to women because they are often more in the position to relay that knowledge to the next generation, right? So that's what my parents told me. And so in the 7th century, Norman, I think it was Norman Daniel, who was a British historian, he said, in the 7th century, the Quran and Muhammad gave women more rights than English women would have for another 1,000 years, which is a remarkable thing, right? So in the 7th century, Muslim women were given the right to divorce, the right to custody of their young children, the right to enter into their own contracts. So they were given legal personhood, legal means to enter into their own contracts and transact their own transactions. And they were they were given mandatory rights of inheritance. And so I always talk about how, I'm sure you read Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. So you know about Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, right? And Elizabeth Bennet and her three sisters were not going to get anything. For those of you who like Jane Austen, she wasn't going to get anything because the father's estate would all go to their odious cousin, Mr. Collins, right? And that was in the early 19th century. In the 7th century, and I actually worked this out in my book, if they had been Muslim in the 7th century, they would have mandatorily received, I think it's 5/24 of the estate, but can't be quoted on that. But they had a mandatory right to inheritance. A daughter wouldn't get as much of a son because the son was in charge of the whole tribe and he went to war, but she would get a mandatory portion. So those were some of the rights that Muslim women got. And if they were not equal rights the way that we think of equal rights, I mean, they weren't. It was easier for a man to get a divorce than a woman to get a divorce. But just the fact that she could get a divorce when English women couldn't get a divorce until the late 1800s, I mean, that was a remarkable thing. So it's not the literal provisions that I look at. It's the fact that even in the 7th century, the rights of women were of such concern to the Quran and Muhammad. So how could it not be a feminist religion when it was so progressive for the 7th century? And to take that as the maximum is not right. It was progressive for its time. It was feminist for its time. And certainly there are lots of now Muslim women scholars who are reinterpreting Islam, the Quran now in modern ways that unread some of the interpretations of medieval men. Because, 7th, 8th, 9th century men, it was very hard for them to understand how women could get all these rights. Like, how is this possible that they got part of the estate? Why did they get part of the estate? They didn't go to war. So women's rights were not a thing in the 7th and 8th century.
Right. So like any religion, it's adapting to the times that it's in. And just to summarize and clarify, what we're seeing in terms of women's human rights violations in certain Islamic majority countries is more to do with the fact that they're developing nations. It's a socio-cultural issue, you're saying, rather than specifically to do with an inherent flaw in Islamic or Sharia law.
That's right. I don't think there's anything in Sharia or Islam that prevents a woman from doing anything she wants to do, really. I mean, and the fact that in the world there have been 14 Muslim women who have been presidents or prime ministers of Muslim populations, that proves that Muslim women can be what they want to be, right? I mean, I tell people this and most of them are shocked. Most people don't know that there have been 14 Muslim women presidents and prime ministers, and that's 14 more than we've had in the United States, I might just point out. Right. And the fact that men elected them and that they were respected as women heads of state, I mean, that should tell you something right there, right? There's also a study that came out a few years ago that showed that opportunities for women around the world were primarily due to poverty. They controlled for all other factors, and they found, nope, it wasn't religion, it wasn't culture, it wasn't politics. The number one factor that prevented women from opportunities was poverty. And I do know someone who builds girls' schools in Pakistan, and she said, yeah, the Taliban are a problem. They do cause problems. They do burn down schools every so often, but by far the worst obstacle to girls going to school is poverty.
Okay, thank you. We've got some nice questions coming in here from the audience, and just to build on that topic of women and women's rights, there's a question from Alana asking, what are your views on the hijab and burqa?
Oh, so that's a good question. And, you know, I think because it's so visible, it tends to get more attention than it should, because we're very visual creatures, human beings are, right? And so, so in Islamic law, the Quran has really only 3 verses of the 6,200 and I think 37 verses of the Quran. Only 3 have to do with clothing, so it's not a big deal for the Quran what you wear. But there are 3, and one says that men should be modest and women should be modest, and it's a very equal sounding verse. So men should be modest, women should be modest. Men should lower their eyes in modesty, and women should lower their eyes in modesty. So the question was, for Islamic scholars, what's modest, right? And modesty, as they understood, can change according to time and place and culture, right? You wouldn't wear the same thing to the beach as you would to a concert at Carnegie Hall. At least I hope. So it's a subjective thing. So the Islamic scholars who discussed, and they discussed what was modest for men too, but with respect to women, they all agreed that women should be covered from their shoulders to their knees. But beyond that, there was disagreement. So, for example, most of them said that only the hands, face, and feet should show, but they disagreed on what's the hands. Is it the hand to the wrist or the hand to the elbow? If you have to cover your hair, well, do you have to cover it from the very front of your face, or can just something down the back of your head be enough? You know, does feet can show, but does feet mean feet to the ankle or feet to the knees? So there was all kinds of disagreement. Most of them said that Muslim women should cover their hair, but some of them didn't say that. As far as burqas, very, very few of them said that a face veil, that women should cover their faces. And in fact, most Islamic scholars believe that the face veil predates Islam, to a time when both men and women covered their faces, really to keep the sand out. And also veiling tended to be associated also, for example, in the Persian Empire with high class. So high class women veiled just to show their high status, and that somehow also became associated with Islam. But most Islamic scholars do not think that the face veil is something that's required. In fact, on Hajj, you're not allowed to wear a face veil. And I think in Al-Azhar in Egypt, Cairo, also you're not allowed to wear a face veil in class if you're a woman student. So I'll give you just an example of this. In Egypt, about 10 years ago, there was a big public debate between 2 very high-level Islamic scholars. One was the Grand Mufti of Al-Azhar University, and the other one was the head of the Supreme Court, who is a renowned Sharia scholar. And they had a big debate in the public of whether a Muslim woman had a duty to cover her hair. And one said she didn't have a duty to cover her hair, and the other one said she did. And they're both learned, they both had lots of documentation and support for their positions. And they reach different conclusions. So this is fiqh in action, right? You have 2 fatwas, you have 2 Islamic scholars, and you know they're saying, well, I don't think a woman has to cover her hair, but God knows best. And the other one saying, well, I think a woman does have a duty to cover her hair, but God knows best. And as a Muslim, I can decide, who do I want to follow? Whose opinion do I want to follow? And each of them is valid. Each of them are valid opinions. So that's yeah.
So when we hear about it being imposed on people, again, that's an extremist way of doing things, as opposed to actually coming from the essence of Sharia.
Yeah, so nobody says it's okay to impose it. So even the guy who said, yeah, it's a duty to cover your hair, doesn't say, and if you don't do it, you should be imprisoned or attacked or whatever. So even I mean, there's no evidence that the Prophet Muhammad ever forced any woman to cover her hair. So these are all academic questions. Like, should you or shouldn't you? And they, they disagree on whether you should or you shouldn't. But nobody except like the Taliban and ISIS, like nobody says you do or else.
Right. Thank you. And there's a comment from Nurhan on this that just says there's nothing in the Quran that says you have to cover your hair or how the hijab should look like. It was only a cultural development, like you were saying, of what men thought it should be, not to forget that people were living in the desert, again, something you commented on, and both men and women covered their head from the sun. And Nurhan says, please make this clear. So just wanting to reiterate that.
Yeah, and there is still disagreement on that. I mean, that's certainly one view that Islamic scholars have, but there are other views as well. I happen to agree with Nurhan, but there are other scholars like the Grand Mufti of Al-Azhar who said, no, you have a duty to cover your hair. But let's remember, in the 7th century, everybody in the world covered their hair. Everybody, there are so many pictures of the Madonna and Child, and she always has her hair covered, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's just what people did at the time. So.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
There's a question I'm glad from Nazanin. I'm glad Nazanin is asking this because we had talked about it a bit before we started. The question is, can you speak to the representation of Sufism in the West as being distinct and separate from Islam?
Oh, so interesting, isn't it, that we were talking about this, Ross? Yeah. So I remember I was I think in my 20s, and I was working, and this colleague burst into my office, and she said, I found it. I found the answer. I'm going to be a Sufi. And it's true. Like, people in the West tend to think of Sufism as different from Islam, and they don't even realize it's part of the same religion. So it's very strange to me because so to be a Sufi, you first have to be a Sunni or Shia Muslim. So it's kind of like, imagine a circle, and imagine a point in the center of the circle that's God. So Sufism is like a line from the perimeter of the circle to the center. It's like a way to reach God, a way to be closer to God. But first you have to stand on the circle, and the circle is to be a Muslim, either Shia or Sunni. So you can have Shia Sufis or Sunni Sufis. It's hard to say that really fast. but you do have to be Muslim first before you can be a Sufi. It's a part of Islam. You believe in Islam, and then you follow this way. Sufism is not a sect. It's a way. It's a way to be closer to God. Mm-hmm. So when people say, oh, I'm a Sufi, but not a Muslim, it's like saying, well, I'm a Christian, but I don't believe in Jesus Christ. And to me, it's cultural misappropriation, because it's taking this practice and removing it from its origin. It's okay. You don't have to. It's okay to sort of partake in Sufi practices. I'm not saying that everybody who partakes in Sufi practices has to be a Muslim, but you have to understand that to call yourself a Sufi, you have to be a Muslim. And I think a lot of this also has colonial baggage attached to it, because when the British and the French colonized Muslim lands, and by the way, nearly 90% of Muslim lands were colonized by Western powers for a century or more. That had a huge disruptive effect on Muslim civilization. So they came across Sufism and they liked it, and so they separated it from Islam. It's like, oh, we like Sufism. It's not like those hated Muslims. It's not like it's not Islam, but but it's just a different way of thinking about Islam. I mean, there have been militant Sufis. Sufis have gone to war. Other Muslims, not Sufis, have been pacifists. So this kind of black and white delineation is really not accurate.
Right. Okay. Thank you. There's an interesting question from Sol, who says, or Saul, pardon my pronunciation, thank you for writing your books and for sharing these perspectives. does it become mentally exhausting to keep answering the same questions over and over, especially the ones based on misinformation? How would you like, how would you like discussions with non-Muslims about Islam to be?
You know, John Esposito, who is a professor of Islamic studies at Georgetown, he says he has the best job in the world because he just answers the same questions over and over again. So I have to say, though, it becomes a little disheartening sometimes because I do feel like, boy, I'm trying and trying and trying. And, you know, we've all been trying to explain ourselves, and it's very hard to overcome some of these stereotypes. We're not the only ones, though. You know, Black people have been dealing with the same kind of stuff for decades, centuries, really. But there is a reason. Should we talk about this a little bit? There is a, you know, when I was thinking about the disinformation campaign and how they wanted to raise the specter of a scary Islamic law, the question in my mind was, why were people so quick to believe this guy? All it would have taken was a call to an Islamic studies professor or an imam at a mosque just to debunk this idea that Islamic law was trying to take over the United States. So why were they quick to believe the fearmonger? And the answer is actually because there's a long historical tradition in the West of viewing Muslims through the lens of the enemy. This is akin to anti-Semitism. So when Islam was born in the 7th century, Muslims knew about Christianity and Judaism. The Prophet Muhammad had Christian relatives. He had Jews in his community. And in fact, Islam accepts Judaism and Christianity as part of itself. So there was no fear on the part of Muslims towards these traditions. But for Western European Christians, they saw this new phenomenon, and to them, of course, it was a false religion. So they saw this new phenomenon and it was spreading fast, and they thought, well, how could a false religion spread so fast? It must be because they're converting people at sword point. It must be because, you know, they're the Antichrist. Muhammad is the Antichrist. And so they never really, I mean, they didn't know any Muslims. They didn't really have contact with them. And so there grew up this whole mythology around what Muslims believed and practiced. And some of them are like outrageous things. There are whole books written on this, so I won't get into it, but a whole mythology of tall tales. And this infused our historical narratives, literature. It still infuses our film and television, textbooks. So this whole lens of how we view Muslims as the enemy is still with us, and it comes at us from all different directions. So the media is subject to the same lens, the same framework as anybody else. The media amplifies it. So the fact that Muslims are never on the media unless we do something bad, that's typical of seeing Muslims through the lens of the enemy, right? If Muslims are the enemy, then everything they do is going to be bad. If they do something good, we're just going to ignore it. So that's, I mean, the fact that people are so shocked when I say there have been 14 Muslim women presidents and prime ministers. They start writing, they want me to tell them the names and the countries. And I always say, you can Google them, they're presidents. They're not a secret. So that, I mean, that is why there is this, such a resistance. It's like a cultural framework that we're living in, and it's cultural confirmation bias, which is why it's so hard to overcome some of these ways of looking at Muslims. And so going back to the question, sometimes it is disheartening. Sometimes it's frustrating to try to talk about all this. But, you know, then I tell myself that, okay, it might be a drop in the bucket, but drops make a river.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
I like it at the end of the book. You talk about shifting from an us versus them paradigm to an all of us outlook. And that seems very important. This idea of othering each other, regardless of what religion or group we're talking about, is only going to be harmful to all of us in the end.
It really is. And I do believe that if God or perfection or whatever you want to call it is at the top of a mountain, then there are lots of different paths up the mountain. So I do believe that, and I think we all need to believe that. And also, so many of us believe, I think it's maybe a natural human tendency to believe that this is a zero-sum equation, that if other people do better, then I must be doing worse. But that's not necessarily the case. We can all do better, and I mean, we can all do better together. And I think that's where we have to stop thinking of an us them sort of mentality. It hampers us. It causes warfare. It paints people as the enemy that we have to go and obliterate. It distracts us from the real problems in the world. Like, how many trillions of dollars have we spent on war since 9/11? According to Physicians for Social Responsibility, the US and its allies in the last 20 years have killed up to 2 million Muslim civilians.
Wow.
That's a huge
shocking.
number.
Yeah, that's shocking.
So, and it's because of this us, them, you're with us or you're against us mentality. And it prevents us from seeing clearly, I think.
Yes. I want to thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us today. This is a really important and timely conversation, I think, and I'm grateful for you presenting your ideas so clearly and calmly and skillfully. And I'm sure you face a lot of pressure and obstacles in the work you're doing. So I really wish you well.
Oh, thank you. And thank you so much for having me. It's been an honor.
To let everybody know, again, we've been speaking with Sumbul Ali-Karamali, and her latest book is called Demystifying Sharia: What it is, how it works, and why it's not taking over our country. If you want to learn more about her, you can go to her website. The easiest one to remember is probably muslimnextdoor.com, for those who might have trouble spelling your name. Big thank you to the Banyan Books, the whole community, everybody that works behind the scenes in the store at Banyan Books, our owner Colin, who's been doing it since inception and still at it, and of course our amazing events coordinator and podcast producer Jacob Steele for all that he does for Banyan Books and these programs. Again, Sumbul, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Have a great night, everybody. Thanks for joining us for Branches of Wisdom, a podcast of Banyan Books and Sound, Canada's spiritual and healing resource since 1970. Our podcast producer is Jacob Steele. The show is edited by Abdo Habani. And I'm your host, Ross McKeechee. Watch all our conversations on YouTube by searching for Banyan Books, or listen on your favorite podcast platform. Please subscribe, follow, like, and leave your reviews and comments. We love to hear from you. For all our live events, books, and more, visit us at banyan.com.